to see everyone, and great to be participating in the network meeting and have the opportunity to participate even more actively by introducing this session. For those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name's Sharon Hausum, and I am in Albuquerque, New Mexico, on the ancestral lands of the Southern Tiwa Pueblo people. I'm currently part-time faculty at the University of New Mexico, where I teach Indigenous environmental planning with an emphasis on climate change. And my role here with ASAP is as a member of the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, the JEDI Committee. And specifically working on as the chair of the accountability group. I'm pleased to acknowledge also the other members of the JEDI leadership team: Shamika Hansen, Galen Truer, Vanessa Luke, Alex Basaraba, and Julia Kim. But also really important to note that we are very reliant on the ASAP staff and are just incredibly appreciative of all of their involvement and support for everything that the JEDI Committee is doing. The JEDI Committee has a great history and timeline, which is available through the ASAP website and Google Drive, and right now is set up as the diagram that's showing indicates. We have the leadership team, and then we have two groups. We have a community of practice, which is exploring how we all are engaging in JEDI issues in our work, and also the accountability group. And the goal of the accountability group is to hold ASAP itself accountable in JEDI as an organization. And these sessions, this plenary, is part of ASAP's overall JEDI work and ensuring that we are all, as ASAP members, engaged with justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So the purpose of this session is really to provide an opportunity for all of us as members to learn, to grow, to process, and build trust among each other as we commit to leveraging this network and our own resources to promote justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the climate adaptation field and beyond. We're hoping that you'll learn something new and gain some new perspectives about JEDI and adaptation, and also be inspired to critically examine elements of your own adaptation practice and your orientation within the overall field of adaptation. The guiding theme for this session is advancing justice and equity amidst urgency. As more of us are doing this climate work, how do we ensure that we slow down to use best practices that keep justice and equity at the center of our work? We chose this topic because it reflects a tension that many ASAP members feel. We know there's an urgent need to mitigate and adapt. We also know there's renewed political ambition to address climate change, especially with the recent IPCC report proclaiming a climate emergency. But we also know that words like emergency and crisis can be used to justify skipping the often slow, nuanced, and intentional work that's needed for truly just and equitable adaptation and resilience. So the goal for this session, our hope, is that you'll come away with a better ability to articulate and act on maintaining the centrality of justice and equity in adaptation amidst urgency. So we have today, as Rachel explained, both a keynote and then a panel, and then of course the breakout sessions. And our keynote speaker is somebody who I am really thrilled to welcome to this network meeting. He's someone whose work I follow as closely as I possibly can, a really significant voice in Indigenous climate adaptation work. Kyle Whyte is the George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. His research addresses environmental justice, focusing on climate policy and Indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperative relationships between Indigenous peoples and science organizations, and the problems of Indigenous justice in food sovereignty, environmental justice, and the Anthropocene. Kyle is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. He currently serves on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the Management Committee of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, and the Board of Directors of the Pesticide Action Network North America. He's previously served as an author for the U.S. Global Change Research Program and as a member of the Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resource Science in the U.S. Department of Interior, and on 2 environmental justice work groups convened by past state governors of Michigan. Kyle is involved with a number of organizations that advance Indigenous research and education methodologies, including the Climate and Traditional Knowledges Work Group, the Sustainable Development Institute at the College of Menominee Nation, the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, and Nga Pe Ote Maramatanga, New Zealand's Maori Center of Research Excellence. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Kyle Whyte.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for the nice introduction. And it's been fantastic to work in the same context and field as you, given how much I admire the work that you do and your contributions, both as an educator and as a planner. And I was hoping to get going if I'd just be able to share my screen with everybody, because I prepared some slides for the presentation. Thank you very much. And I wanted to just start off by saying, that I've worked with so many different amazing organizations, from tribal colleges to policy groups to intertribal organizations. And I haven't quite, been part of a field like the adaptation field. It's a field that to be in it requires a tremendous amount of empathy, a tremendous amount of groundedness. It's a field that really has to grapple with that tension between science and society, and to find solutions to just some of the most vexing challenges at the interface of different types of knowledge. And in adaptation, you have so many different pathways. I mean, on the one hand, in my work, I've done very long-term planning projects with tribes and other communities. At the same time, I've worked on the front lines with communities that are experiencing some of the most detrimental impacts of climate change right now. And a field like adaptation spans all of those different journeys and all of the different types of work that needs to be done, whether it's work that's right away or work whose benefits will be seen several generations from now. I wanted to share a few philosophical thoughts, both about working on adaptation in the context I work in, Indian country, but also on how we understand what it means to be urgent about climate change. And I think there's a lot of different perspectives on what it means to be urgent, and it's a good time for us right now to really revisit the topic of what we're urgent about. Are we urgent about climate change impacts? Or are we urgent about other types of things that we can focus our attention on that directly implicate justice and equity and the well-being of Indigenous people and many other diverse communities who are facing adverse impacts from climate change? And so to begin with, I wanted to frame what will later be some remarks about urgency with just some contextual remarks about the context that I work in. And I work in the context of tribal nations, and primarily in the context of the United States. And many tribal nations were responsible for stewarding many acres of land with all sorts of different relatives on it, plants and animal communities, ecosystems, habitats, as well as economic and financial resources. And so I think it's important that when we think about climate change adaptation from the standpoint of Indigenous people within a context like the United States, it's adaptation work that's occurring within a very active efforts to engage in nation building and community development and to really create transformation given the centuries of oppression and domination that many of our communities have experienced. And another just key aspect is that, climate change is something that as Indigenous people, we're some of the most active folks anywhere taking action to address climate change. And a lot of this, importantly, is a contribution that Indigenous people have made alongside of adaptation professionals. But in the last National Climate Assessment, there was a tribal chapter, and the authors and some other colleagues partnered with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and created this incredible documentation of adaptation actions that Indigenous people are taking within the context of the United States. And when that chapter first came out a few years ago, there were about 800 actions, and currently there's well over 1,000. And actually, in Indian country, when you try to document something, you usually only get about a third of what might be out there. So, I would say there's probably at least 3,000 different actions that Indigenous people are taking on adaptation. And if we expand that out to climate change more broadly and include all of the Indigenous actions to resist the fossil fuel industry, to resist dirty supply chains and other contributors to high carbon footprints, well, that number proliferates even more. And I don't know what some of you think, but given there's just several million Indigenous people in the context of the United States, and just in this graphic, the bottom end is that there's 1,000 actions they're taking on climate change. I wouldn't say that in the state of Michigan, where there's 10 million people, that there's over 1,000 actions that people are taking to address climate change. So I think it puts in perspective a little bit about where many of our communities are coming from, that we're taking action to address climate change, oftentimes doing it on a shoestring budget, and doing so because we know that our food security, our food sovereignty, our right to have access to a clean, healthy, and safe environment, our rights to continue our cultural traditions, which oftentimes depend on certain ecosystems and habitats. Those are critical for us, and climate change is a threat to all of those things. But actually, for Indigenous people, our story of climate change is much, much older than just the fact that we're responsive to environmental change as it's occurring right now, and as we understand it to be occurring in the future. In fact, when you look at Indigenous history, and for those of us who are members of communities who have had the opportunity to learn about many of our stories and to learn from different generations of people in our communities, we've been dealing with climate change for a long time, and we've had a respect for the climate system for some time. So for example, notice the difference between this graphic and the orange one I showed you earlier, which, the orange one had little borders and boxes to designate where tribes are located. But for Anishinaabe people, for example, Indigenous people of the Great Lakes region, one of the Indigenous people whose homelands is the Great Lakes, and the tribe I'm part of, Potawatomi, we're Anishinaabe people. But notice, if you look at kind of a way of thinking about our homelands that's a little bit closer to how we think of it, it's not really about, which box corresponds to which tribal nation. It's actually the idea that we were spread across the Great Lakes region with great geographic diversity. People lived in different places throughout the year. People had different kinship and family and political relationships with all sorts of different people. They were multilingual. And our societies were actually structured and organized to be as responsive to a changing climate as possible. So for our societies, it wasn't about, let's figure out a good way to organize our politics and our social life and our cultural life, and then figure out how to adapt to climate change when we're threatened. We were already designing our societies to be as adaptive as possible to interannual change and to seasonal change. And so this isn't to say that we have all of these solutions to climate change, but it is to say that climate change is a topic that we've been on top of for a long time. In fact, if you think about the different sciences and knowledge traditions of indigenous people, one thing you could probably say, at least for Anishinaabe people, is that climate science is actually our oldest science, and that we wouldn't necessarily agree with the idea that climate science is a species of broader science, but rather any kind of scientific activity must take into consideration the relationship between society and climate. And so oftentimes indigenous planning processes for adapting to climate change have to do with recovering those traditions. And this is, for example, a seasonal wheel that's a way of expressing indigenous knowledge, indigenous planning, indigenous adaptation strategy that has multiple layers of understanding what it means to live in a way where you're trying to be as responsive as possible to constant changes around you. And one of the important parts, if we go more in depth into this way of thinking, is it's actually a different way of experiencing time. And it creates a certain type of warning system and response system that comes from an indigenous approach and an indigenous way of thinking about climate change. And so in a lot of the activities and events I've been part of, when I have the opportunity to philosophize and think through these issues with other people, it's really a chance to just engage with all sorts of different ways of thinking about time. And so for me, one way of thinking about time that I've developed is, so you're living in a society and you first start with the fact that you're always experiencing and anticipating change. And so a lot of indigenous approaches to climate change just assume that the world is always in motion. The environment's always in motion, whether seasonally, across years, in a circadian way. There's just that's the constant, is change and perpetual transformation. But to live in a society means that each change that you experience is associated with something that society does. And so in a lot of indigenous ways of telling time, right, people don't talk about just a change in weather or a change in water temperature, but rather they talk about the social activities that go along with those changes or that themselves are disrupted by the changes. So for example, a ceremony is supposed to occur at a different time of year, or a family harvesting activity occurs at a certain time of year, or a diplomatic activity occurs at a particular time of year. And it's timed, or they are timed, with different environmental cues. And so it's very hard to talk about an environmental cue without talking about the social activities that go along with it. And for a lot of indigenous people, one of the English terms that gets used to talk about social activities is kinship responsibilities. If you're in a ceremonial context or a harvesting context, you're exercising kinship responsibilities to the environment, to animals and plants, to other human beings. And so those social activities are ways to build kinship bonds, mutual bonds with the environment, with people around you. And those are constantly shifting and changing throughout the year. And even in more detail, those kinship responsibilities are actually opportunities to affirm what we know are key ingredients to a society that can be as responsive to change as possible, right? A society that has high levels of trust, reciprocity, consent, respect, and inclusivity. That's a society that I want to be in if we're in crisis, because I know that those bonds are going to make it possible for us to come together to be as responsive as possible. And so a lot of indigenous practices that are associated with different cues and changes throughout the year, they're intended to strengthen, to affirm, to renew those types of qualities that we know make it for a resilient society. And it's no different from the case that if I ever get into a crisis myself, who do I call? The first person I call is somebody who I trust, who I know respects a reciprocal relationship with me, who respects consensuality, who has mutual respect for me, and who is inclusive and listens to what I have to say and listens to the knowledge that I have. And so the more you have these qualities, the more that you actually have a cohesive society, a society that can be prepared, a society that can be adaptive. And the minute that we see the cues are changing and the ceremonies, the harvesting activities, the economic activities, the political activities are being disrupted, that sends a huge warning signal. That makes it so that we have to come together and figure out what's happening with the environment and figuring out how we can activate those important qualities that we need to be able to respond. And so this is a way of thinking about time that doesn't require a clock. It doesn't require days or hours. It requires a way of thinking about time where you're fully plugged into the changing environment, but you're actually measuring that time through different changes in kinship relationships. And if you take this way of thinking about time and just multiply it, for thousands of years, it creates a very different way of thinking about what is urgent about the climate change crisis that we're in right now. And I remember when I was in school, I was typically taught linear time. I was typically taught this sort of time where almost all of the educational experience that I had was focused on what happened during the last couple hundred years that the US has been in power, the industrial period. And this is how a lot of climate change is framed as well, because climate change is seen as something that was caused by industrial technologies and industrialization, and that it's something that is threatening the way of life that people have become accustomed to within industrial conditions. And obviously, industrialization would not have been able to take root if it wasn't for colonialism and racial capitalism and patriarchy and ableism and other systems of power. But oftentimes we're sort of fed this idea that the most significant period of time is this sort of, US industrial period. I'm again speaking from a US context. And then there's sort of like stuff that happened in the past, but it's not really that well articulated. And so the idea is, how can we adapt or prepare for climate change in ways that lessen the impact of climate change on the industrial conditions? But for Indigenous peoples, so say for Anishinaabe people, this is not really how one might tell time. We understand there's been periods of time before in which we've lived under colonization or been at warfare with others, but we recognize that our history is thousands of years old and that we've gone through different transitions and changes and so on. And right now, we're just in another sliver of that larger history, and we're living in colonial conditions. And there's nothing normal about the colonial conditions we're living in. There's nothing that we're particularly happy about or excited about or even wanting to protect or preserve, because we're actually living under colonization. The official policy of the United States is that the United States has plenary power over tribes. And so we're in a colonial period, and the industrialization that created the wealth of a country like the United States would not have been possible without the dispossession of our lands. And so for us, we're trying to get out of the colonial period. We're trying to get into something better. We're not trying to preserve things that are taken for granted by privileged people for today. We want a totally different world in which no people are going to have to live under colonialism. And so our perspective situates today's time in a broader history. And the point about land dispossession is critical. The fossil fuel industry that so many of us in the adaptation profession are working hard to compensate for in a certain way of understanding adaptation work is literally one that was able to take root because of violations of Indigenous consent, because of a lack of empathy, and because of many forms of violence that made it possible for those industries to freely develop themselves and engage in acts and economic activities that we know are extremely problematic for the environment. And there's also the hidden stories of exactly how these industries dispossessed Indigenous people of their land, both at the level of widespread dispossession and relocation, but even within particular Indian reservations or service areas, the further erosion of Indigenous control over our lands. And so in this way, right, the work of responding to climate change is both about the climate change impacts themselves, but also about the vulnerabilities that Indigenous people have because we've gone through several hundred years of colonialism and racial capitalism and are dealing with a situation where we have inadequate infrastructure, inadequate control over territorial bases, and many, many struggles to continue our cultures, to protect our mental health and physical health. And when we think about climate change urgency in this historical context, there are some words out there that people use to describe the urgency of climate change that I'd really just suggest that folks take the time to rethink. So given the types of things I've described, is it fair to say that the climate change crisis today is unprecedented? Is it new or novel? Given land dispossession itself is a form of human-caused climate change on another group of people because it moves them from one location or the other or to the other, or shrinks their adaptation options by dramatically reducing their land base or their capacity to exercise self-determination over their land? Is it really something that is best understood as new or novel, given that for a lot of Indigenous people, they're ancient stories about climate change and how people had to understand what it means to take responsibility to do something about that change, whether or not it's true that humans 1,000 years ago could have caused certain types of climate change. The point is, the idea of having to deal with systematic environmental change is also deeply embedded within many Indigenous traditions. And so for folks that talk about non-Indigenous scientists as the discoverers of climate change, going back to discoveries in science in the 19th century, again, is also problematic and privileges that industrial period and sort of emphasizes the fact that when we talk about climate change work today, it's primarily about how to protect or preserve what's taken for granted about industrial ways of life. And crisis and urgency. What does it mean to think that we believe that climate change is a crisis, but all the other previous colonial violence that was tied to dangerous impacts on the land was not a crisis? Why is this a crisis, but nobody was that urgent about dealing with those other crises, especially given those crises frame and make worse the climate change crisis? The idea of normalcy and back to normal, which we hear a lot with regard to the public health issues we're facing right now, but also people discuss with regard to climate change. But for communities that are disproportionately impacted by both viruses and climate change alike, there's nothing normal about the conditions we're living in right now that would make our communities that vulnerable. So what does it mean to go back to normal? What does it mean that we're at a critical juncture with climate change if we're forgetting the fact that when Native people endured residential schools and boarding schools, that would have also been a critical juncture from a standpoint of Native people, or when treaty rights were violated, that also would have been a critical juncture. And given that Native people still struggle for educational sovereignty and treaty rights as solutions to climate change today, those critical junctures are merging with the critical juncture of climate change. Hope. What do we mean by hope? And hope in a world where many communities want to see action, where many communities want change now. What does it mean to attribute hope? And do we even need hope to be urgent about climate change? I discussed linear time a little while ago. And another thing I'll mention is local versus global. Is it true that Indigenous people are mainly a local perspective on climate change? Given that what oftentimes goes for a global perspective on climate change is a particular ethnic understanding of climate change that takes itself to be a global one, whereas all communities have a global imagination and different conceptions of the globe and the earth and the planet. And so I think when we use these types of terms, it's important to actually really interrogate and investigate what they mean. And I do this a lot myself because I know it's important, because if you communicate, for example, to someone who's experienced 2 centuries of land dispossession that climate change is unprecedented, it kind of sounds like you might be forgetting all that they've been through and not really being responsive to their needs and their concerns with climate change and other topics that are important to them. And so for adaptation professionals, I think it's extremely important to ask questions about whether the work of adaptation is fulfilling the types of environmental solutions that Indigenous people are advocating for. Indigenous people are attempting to transform rights, attributing them to nature and water and non-human entities. They're attempting to restore diplomacy across Indigenous people, right? Colonialism isolated us into particular tribal entities. We're seeking to restore those alliances and those coalitions that sustained our communities for generations. Is adaptation work rooted in land-based education that conveys to people the successes and the knowledge of Indigenous people? And is adaptation work participating in the reconciliation, restorative justice, and peacemaking that is needed to defeat colonialism and really defeat colonialism? And so in recent work, a group of 90 authors and over, I think, 36 or 38 testifiers put together this report called The Status of Tribes and Climate Change, and it was overseen by the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. And I really like this new report, which just came out, because it provides some of the texture that I was describing, some of the historical texture, the social texture. It gives respect to the history, and it includes just so many voices who are engaging with science, engaging with Indigenous knowledge, engaged in narrative. And it focuses on many of the broad issues that Indigenous people are facing in the US context with respect to climate change. And you'll see an amazing integration of Indigenous and allied perspectives and storytelling traditions, including science, which itself is a storytelling tradition. And again, there's no ignoring or obfuscation of colonialism, as you can see on the lower right or left-hand side of this visual model in terms of how climate change is understood. So to conclude, I think right now adaptation work is really work that can be at the forefront of what's happening with our government right now. And one of the policies that the federal government is taking very seriously, which is an Executive Order 14008, is that there has to be a whole of government approach to climate change. There has to be an interagency and interdisciplinary approach. It can't just be confined to agencies that have the most superficial relevance to the environment, but has to be based on the understanding that all agencies are doing work that's relevant to the environment and to the climate system. And one of the powerful policies is called Justice 40, which is tied to the massive infrastructure investments that Congress and the federal government are considering right now, and which will increase resilience infrastructure by billions of dollars if everything goes through. And the Biden-Harris administration is committed to the idea that when you look at all of those investments, 40% of the benefits must go to underserved communities, to communities affected by environmental injustice, including many tribal and Indigenous communities. And so a lot of us are trying to figure out what that 40% means, that 40% benefit means. And just to fully wrap up, for the adaptation profession, a couple of things that I'm noticing are areas for further conversation. Is so much today of environmentalism is now being understood through infrastructure. But infrastructure is not just about engineering. It's about who owns the infrastructure, who has access to the financial tools for it, who exercises sovereignty over that infrastructure. And so climate change planning processes that are sensitive to infrastructure issues, especially those that many tribal communities face, who have suffered from having been left out of every major period of infrastructure investment in the United States. What does it mean to build new resilient infrastructure in that context where there's already that big of a deficit? And again, who owns it? Is it the money just going to flow to outside contractors? Are there the financial tools, the community banks, the loan programs to be able to create that type of sovereignty and ownership? There are different ways to be urgent. Like, what are you urgent about? Are you just urgent about the climate change impacts? Or are you urgent about a couple hundred years of colonialism and racial capitalism that fostered the climate crisis, and it needs to be fixed simultaneously as a strategy for addressing climate change? And the adaptation profession is going to be increasingly connected up with the discussions about energy and sustainable economies. And while I know that that work already exists quite a bit in adaptation, and it's sort of a false distinction to separate adaptation from mitigation, there's so much effort right now to understand climate change through energy. And I think the adaptation profession has many, many lessons to teach people that have been engaged in mitigation, including a lot of the types of lessons that I feel are important based on what I was just presenting. So I appreciate the chance to share with you. I look forward to our further engagements today.
Thank you, Kyle, for all of that. I have so many thoughts about it, and will probably just withhold my own questions and responses and comments in the interest of checking in with the questions that have been coming in the chat. I'll give other people a chance on that without weighing in too much myself. But I really, really appreciate it. And I will say that it's always a great opportunity in hearing you present to just reflect on my own work in climate change and work with tribes, and my own personal need for patience and reducing a sense of urgency in a lot of my own climate work. So we've got a few questions that have come in, and I will start with Sean's, who notes that he's taking away the need to emphasize climate wisdom in action, a step beyond spreading climate information, which can be a really tough step for the culture of Western institutions. Do you have any advice on how to keep us moving in this direction towards wisdom rather than just information at scales like the federal government, and not to reduce this challenge to a data and information problem?
Thanks for the question, Sean, which I really appreciate. And there's a lot of ways I was thinking about how to respond to that. And I think I'm going to choose the most boring way. but what I want to say, at the federal level right now, at least with some of the agencies and the work with the White House that I'm involved in, that question is really the one that is causing people the most loss of sleep right now, because basically what we see happening is the Democratic Party really wanting to infuse resources into science, into infrastructure, into community building. But how do you do that in a way that's truly equitable, and it emphasizes, again, wisdom and actual change-making practices, as opposed to just information that nobody's accountable to? And so there's been all these activity, like in the White House Environmental Justice Advisory, we're trying to develop a scorecard with how you actually measure those types of investments in terms of whether they translate into the exercise of, just to use your language, wisdom for communities to be able to grapple with environmental issues. And so I really think that for the future professionals and the current professionals, this is exactly the challenge we need to be focusing our efforts on. And there aren't yet clear answers, even though some of you have probably been successful in some of the contexts that you work with in engaging with Sean's question. Thanks.
Thanks, Kyle. Susie Mosier also has a related question about knowledge. How can we draw on the experience Indigenous peoples have without just perpetuating colonial extractivist approaches to learning and knowledge? And
Thanks for the question, Susie. And I think the important part, and I've written about this a little bit in my work, is to really understand the different stories that we're all part of. And I think the important thing is that, Indigenous knowledge and wisdom and experience doesn't exist without there being the educational and other types of institutions within Indigenous communities that sustain that experience and that wisdom and that knowledge. And so I think we need to advocate both for the validation of Indigenous experience, but also doing the hard work of ensuring that Indigenous people can continue and sustain the institutions that they need. For example, the tribal college and university system, they do tremendous work, but for anybody that thinks that that is the vision of what we want from Indigenous educational institutions, it's still not enough, right? We should have the same types of educational institutions that other people have access to, and we should be able to control them ourselves. And so it's important to be doing that work to ensure that we have those institutions so that it's not just taking experience that is in a non-renewable sense, but rather that the action that's being taken supports what we need to continue our self-determination. Thanks again.
Thanks, Kyle. We're getting a lot of great comments also, and appreciation, and thanks for all of your contributions, Kyle, in this presentation and your responses. We've got a couple more questions in there at the moment. Honora Boris is asking about noting about the tribes in Louisiana. Many of them have not been federally recognized, and they are in least sustainable areas along the coast. They've been some of the most affected people in Hurricane Ida and are unable to tap into resources that would be available to sovereign tribes. Honora is wondering if anything's being done at the federal level to help these tribal members.
Yeah, thanks for the amazing question, though. Obviously, you're bringing up an extremely just traumatic and just deeply problematic set of issues there. So just want to lift up all that's happening to those people and communities. Yet that is, though, I mean, the type of situation that really has motivated me to talk about urgency in the way that I have, because I've talked to some adaptation professionals who work in that area, and I've also worked in that area before, and they oftentimes see the lack of federal recognition as sort of a detriment or an impediment or something that stops the adaptation work that needs to be done. But again, that's not necessarily the right way of framing it, because that area has been in crisis for a long time because the tribes were not accredited with the sovereignty that they have. That is the crisis. And the lack of respect for tribal sovereignty in the area is what made it possible for the petrochemical industry, for other industries to dispossess people of their land and to build themselves to be very powerful companies and economic engines and government programs, which is what's pushed many of those peoples into the vulnerable areas of land that they live on. And so I think adaptation professionals have to grasp the fact it's all a crisis, and we have to be educated on how to work to solve the federal recognition issue. At the same time, we're doing vulnerability assessments and resettlement planning and so on. It's not something we can avoid. It's not a stumbling block. It is what we need to be doing, because for those communities, they don't distinguish those issues, and they've been struggling for a long time to deal with the lack of respect for their recognition. So, the federal government is significantly rolling out resources. I saw in the last version of one of the congressional infrastructure bills, over 100 million for just for climate resilience. And if you look at all the other infrastructure investments, it's in the billions, which all could be related to preparation for climate change. And so, yes, the government does have these issues on its mind, but the question will be the practices associated with them, and will the people responsible for doing that work have the right sense of urgency, in my opinion.
Thanks, Kyle. And I think we've got time for one more question, and then we should move to the panel. And this is from Erica Washburn, who is really interested in seeing best examples from a tribal and Indigenous perspective of how to leverage, center, and prioritizing Indigenous engagement in adaptation planning in a way that also includes a restorative action. And she's wondering if you have any suggestions for references for examples like that.
Oh yeah, thanks for the question. And I do, and maybe it would be best if I could provide some of those links to the organizers of the conference, and if there's a way that those can be distributed, I'd be happy to do so.
Yeah, we'll be sending out this recording along with supplemental resources. Perfect.
Okay, music to my ears.
Yeah, and hopefully that will also include some of the other links that have already gone into the chat. There's a link to the status of tribes and climate change, and also the webinar that is coming up with ITEP next week on the stack. So
Fantastic.
that'll be great too. Well, thank you again, Kyle. And we'll move to the panel discussion, in which Kyle will still be a participant. I will go ahead and introduce everyone on the panel, and then we have a series of questions that we will ask them, which will start off with an opportunity for them to tell us a little bit more about themselves. But just for brief introductions of the 4 additional panelists, we have Deborah Butler, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts and Curriculum Fellow at the 5 Colleges Consortium. Her background is working with tribal and indigenous communities in the Southeast United States, as well as with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals out of ITEP, out of NAU, and Rising Voices out of UCAR, on a range of issues surrounding environmental migration and climate mitigation planning. She is a fellow with the National Academies of Sciences Gulf Research Program. We also have Justin Cates, the Emergency Management Director for the City of Nashua, New Hampshire, where he coordinates citywide emergency response efforts, developed the comprehensive emergency management plan for the city, and chairs the local emergency planning committee. Justin has been responsible for coordinating the response and recovery of FEMA-declared disasters, Tropical Storm Irene, the Snowtober Nor'easter, Superstorm Sandy, Winter Storm Nemo, Winter Storm Juno, and pandemic COVID-19. He is a certified emergency manager and currently studying at the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security. He has taught numerous higher education and professional education courses and serves on several emergency management boards and advisory groups, including as president of International Association of Emergency Managers, Region 1. Camilla Lizundia is a young professional working at the nexus of urban planning, climate, and social justice. She has worked with several adaptation-adjacent organizations, including the U.S. Green Building Council, the Huron River Watershed Council, the University of Michigan Urban Scenarios Lab, the City and County of San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, and the City of Ann Arbor Center of the City Council of the Commons. Camilla originally hails from the San Francisco Bay Area and is a Master of Urban and Regional Planning candidate at the University of Michigan. And our 4th additional panelist will be Deborah Newmark, who is an interdisciplinary artist researcher, educator, and community-engaged practitioner currently living in Iqaluit in the Eastern Arctic. Newmark is a Yale School of Public Health certified climate change adaptation practitioner and a senior policy analyst with the Canadian Northern Economic Development Agency's strategic policy team. Newmark was a faculty member in the Goddard College MFA in Interdisciplinary Arts program from July 2003 through May 2021. Their PhD was an inquiry into the relationship between the traumas associated with forced dislocation and the deliberate beautification of home. And they are currently developing 2 new bodies of related artwork. One engages wellness and the cultivation of joy as radical practice. The other is focused on environmental trauma and mainstreaming climate justice. So thank you all very much, panelists, for joining us. we would love to start off the panel, and I am working on getting to the key question to start off the panel, which is, if you would each also give us an individual introduction of yourselves, talking about your adaptation work, including any specific roles in the adaptation community that you hold or have held, and then your background, including any parts of your profession or life experience or personal identity that inform your perspective in today's discussion about climate urgency and justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we can go in the order that I did the introductions. So we'll start with Deborah.
Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased and excited to be with you today. Thank you, Kyle, for your wonderful talk and the provocativeness of the questions and statements that you gave us today. My name is Deborah Butler. I'm originally from the Gulf Coast. I was born and raised in Mobile, Alabama, which is about an hour and a half east of New Orleans on the Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast is settled by Mississippian peoples probably 25,000 years ago, as far as we know. So I give honor to grandmothers and ancestors and relatives, the home of the Biloxi, Choctaw, and Natchez people. The Gulf is a very strange place. It is a sort of a gumbo of indigenous peoples from that were indigenous to the land, as well as indigenous Africans brought over by the Spanish as early as 1502. And a lot of this gumbo mix, the resiliency of the coast, the nature of the coast, the beauty of the coast informs my work. I do a lot of ethnological work, and I also, in my PhD work, am looking at storytelling and the way that indigenous people have always transmitted knowledge through storytelling of ritual. So I bring that to this discussion today, and I'm very excited to engage with everyone as we go forward with the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for joining us and for that introduction. Justin, would you like also to add to your introduction with more description of your adaptation work and your background?
Sure. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you today. Certainly, my background is sort of unique in comparison to most in the adaptation field. Typically, emergency managers have put a lot of emphasis and focus on their work in the consequences of climate change. But my involvement in this field has really been because of a shift in mindset that I think my colleagues have started to look at over the last few decades, which is more focused towards prevention, hazard mitigation, and overall resilience for the communities that we serve. My specific involvement in this space really started over the last 5 to 6 years, where we started changing the role and function of our Office of Emergency Management here in the city of Nashua, New Hampshire, to look more at hazard mitigation as our priority, putting more emphasis towards funding and initiatives to engage our disadvantaged communities within Nashua and have them at the forefront of identifying infrastructure investments, preparedness activities, and initiatives that really could help to reduce risk for our community in the future. The culminating activity that came out of that shift in mindset was our Resilient Nashua initiative, which took place over 2018 and 2019, which updated our hazard mitigation plan for the community, but also set the stage for our new comprehensive plan that the city implemented, which is founded in 3 main principles: equity, resilience, and sustainability. And This is a big change for the city of Nashville, but our administration has prioritized this move, and I'm proud to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Camilla.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Camilla. I am an urban planner, researcher, artist, and mixed race queer woman. Right now, I'm located on the lands of the Anishinaabe and Wyandotte peoples, but my adaptation work began from observing my grandparents yearly being affected by wildfires in California. Thank you all for being here, and I'm excited to share more about my background.
Thanks, Camilla. And Deborah.
Thank you so much. Nasakut, which means good afternoon in Inuktitut. I'm calling in from Iqaluit, place of many fish in Inuktitut, here in the Eastern Arctic, in Nunavut, which is homeland of the Inuit peoples from time immemorial and continuing to be so. And prior to moving up to Iqaluit, I was working with First Nations communities, predominantly in Quebec, on developing strategies for their self-governance, their rights, and reconciliation from an Indigenous perspective. And since moving up here, now just a little bit more than 3 years ago, my work is really informed by Inuit Chajimaja Tuhanit, which is an Inuktitut word that means Inuit society values and cultural values. I've put in a link to the chat where you can download a poster from the IQ values and also get a sense of how integrated they are, which I really appreciated so much of what Kyle mentioned. Took lots of notes, and the importance of seeing the interconnectedness of all of this, that climate change and climate adaptation work can't really be separated out from food insecurity, from transitioning to a circular economy in a Western frame, whereas circularity has been embedded in Indigenous communities forever. And so the work that I do is, on the one hand, very, very policy oriented with and for Inuit communities up here in Nunavut and across the north in Northwest Territories and Yukon as well, particularly on the modern treaties implementations and self-government agreements, and as an artist working at this juncture between climate justice and climate trauma. So I am beyond honored and delighted to be part of this conversation, and I'm really excited for what's going to open with us.
Thank you, Deborah. Kyle, do you want to add anything specifically related to this part of the introductions? Any highlights of your own professional and personal experience?
I'm actually happy for us to move on because I'm excited to hear about what the other panelists have to say about everything. but thanks for checking in with me on that.
So the first question that we have to move along with that is, we've heard of, we know about the need for action and the necessity of justice and equity in our climate action. But what we're discussing is the experience of those two things in tension. So the question for our panelists, all of you, is how do you approach the need to adapt as soon as possible and the need to uphold justice and equity in your adaptation work? And I'm sure I don't need to pick anyone because I'm sure you all have responses at the tips of your tongue on this. So whoever would like to volunteer first on how you address this tension in your own work.
Well, I know I said I wanted to hear from the other panelists, but I'll just say super quickly, the thing I always come back to is inequitable adaptation, right? Inequitable mitigation to climate change is, it actually what that would mean was adaptation where you just have certain privileged populations living in a bubble and everybody else is experiencing worse outcomes. And that can't be what any of us want.
If it's okay, I'll jump in and tag along to that. You know, if I think about the different ways in which change is formulated, we've heard change happens at the speed of trust, or some mention change happens at the speed of relationships. And I think about this question in a different way, and I say radical change, right? Foundational change, change that actually addresses the colonial legacy and ongoing colonial legacy, the ongoing racial injustice across North America and beyond, right? So if we're thinking about radical change, I think that it happens at the speed of social justice, right? So we can't really imagine for me, a bifurcation of these. And so in some ways, the question itself sets up a false dichotomy, right? It sets up a relationship that offers the option that it's okay to make those distinctions between the movement towards this radical change and the need to embed it, to anchor it, to nurture it within a framework of radical social justice. And part of that is looking at place-based knowledge, place-based solutions, and distinctions-based knowledge and distinction-based solutions. And while Kyle was really referencing in his keynote or the previous section of this, the importance of looking not just at the local, but also at the global and how that's always interconnected. There is a reality, even here in Nunavut, if I'm thinking about the 25 Inuit communities, each one is so specific to its location, to its knowledge, to its history, and coming up with a climate change adaptation, rights-based integration approach for Nauyat would look very, very different for one for Kinnight or for Baker Lake or Pengerton. So I'll leave it there, but I do think that even the framing of the question might beg a little bit of a tweaking to not make a false dichotomy between the way we need to go forward, right?
Thanks, Deborah. Camilla?
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I think it's a careful balance, and I'll be the first to admit that I'm impatient for change. I'm patient for justice and for equity, but folks in the adaptation profession also need to slow down. A key takeaway that I want people to have from this call is that a sense of urgency in adaptation work is characteristic of white middle-class dominant culture. A continued sense of urgency makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive, to encourage democratic and thoughtful decision-making. And white folks can frequently sacrifice potential allies for quick and visible results. For example, folks might sacrifice interests of communities of color in order to win victories for white people. So I just want to first say that and lay the foundation down. Secondly, I think it's really easy to get caught up in the buzzwordy culture of resilience and adaptation. And I sometimes get caught up in that futuristic talk myself, but we must not neglect addressing the deeply rooted systemic issues of power and privilege present in the United States and the world.
I want to quickly add in that all of us, I think all of us as adaptation professionals have to remember that people were made vulnerable on purpose. That the reason you have communities like Ile-de-Jean-Charles, the reason that you have communities like Staten Island in New York is that with redlining, well, let me go back even further than that. With displacement of indigenous communities, Ile-de-Jean-Charles is a consolidation of 3 tribes that went into the Louisiana Delta to escape Jacksonian displacement after the war on Spanish Florida. And so they were displaced from homelands and moved into the bayous. And then when oil was discovered in the Gulf of Mexico, oil pipelines laced through the land and destroyed that community even before climate change. So you have a series of historical developments that made people vulnerable on purpose and excluded them from participating as citizens in what this country promises every citizen. And so you've got people who are in inner cities who are put in those vulnerable positions because of redlining, because of segregation, because of Jim Crow throughout the country. You have people who were displaced from homelands, Trail of Tears, sent to reservation places, and their homelands were taken to make way for commodity crops in the South, like cotton and rice and tobacco. And so people were forced into vulnerable places, and they've been there for the last 400 years. So being vulnerable is not new. And so as adaptation planners, as adaptation professionals, we need to understand that there is overlapping trauma and overlapping displacements and overlapping vulnerabilities that have to be addressed first before anything else can happen. And I think that's important for us to remember going forward.
Thank you, Deborah.
I would just, kind of say one key thing that I've tried to do in our work in the city is really educate myself as to some of these underlying systemic issues that impact a lot of the decisions that are made and decisions that have been made. I think one of the key things that I've learned over the past few years has been to acknowledge the current situation and really help myself better understand kind of how we can make change as officials working to try and change infrastructure priorities or to try and move resources into areas of the community that have been impacted after a disaster. So I think my key takeaway is to understand that that balance between deliberate planning for equity and inclusion. I also need to educate myself on sort of the concerns and challenges with the future of our ecosystems and of our communities within the city. So that's sort of my challenge in Nashua.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate that. I'm actually, Justin, if it's okay, going to start with you on this next question also, which specifically says, in what ways are words like emergency and crisis used in your adaptation work, and how are they helpful and how are they hurtful? Obviously, in your case, the word emergency is not only in your work, it's in your title, but how do you see that being helpful and harmful? Sure,
it's a great question, and it's definitely something that we run into conflict with frequently. I'm of the perspective that the name of my office, my job title, is actually really incorrect if we're trying to do the right thing. We focus too much on the consequences, the emergency, the disaster, and we've done so for so long that it's really neglected not only the investments that we can make to reduce risk in communities, but also is really taken away a lot of the focus and emphasis towards the underlying systemic issues that have nothing to do with the work in my office in emergency management. I think ultimately, if communities like Nashua or states or the federal government were to put more emphasis towards trying to lift up communities and focusing less on emergencies, the response to emergencies, we would help to try and reduce a lot of the negative impacts that we've seen for so long in this space. Another thing I think is important for me to kind of throw out there is the concept of urgency when discussing adaptation or climate mitigation or even just hazard mitigation. I look at it from a lens where there's an urgent need to try and do better when including those disadvantaged populations within, for example, the city of Nashua. But there may not be an urgent need to rush through infrastructure projects or preparedness initiatives or things like that without having that inclusive nature to the work to actually put that thing forward. So ultimately, I look at it from a lens of we need to do better, and there's an urgent need for us as practitioners in this space to work with the whole community versus just kind of focusing in on the bubble of the typical people that show up to our planning meetings or our initiatives and activities that we work on.
Thanks. I really appreciate the idea of your job title needing revision, at least in concept, if that's not an actual step to take. And this idea of emergency and crisis also is something that Kyle was speaking to, the importance of recognizing that some of these situations, and all of you have been getting at this with the history as well, these situations are not new. There have been past histories that have served to put people in marginalized and vulnerable positions now, and those have been emergencies as well. So for the rest of you in your work, are you hearing the word emergency used often, and in what ways is it helpful and harmful at this point also?
I can jump in. I really resonated with Justin's words. Yes, words like emergency and crisis can catalyze transformation with integrity. However, without guidance and intention and reflection, what I sometimes see in practice is urgent energy that is frantic and ungrounded and individualistic. So I think this all goes back to how language is being used and who the audience is. I think about how I've learned to engage with conservative coastal communities along Lake Michigan, particularly with regards to private property and coastal erosion. With these particular communities, I tend not to even use inflammatory language like emergency or crisis, or even use the word climate change, because it can be a roadblock. However, I also want to acknowledge that that may be beneficial in the short term, but not in the long term.
I think that this brings, for me, a reframing perhaps of the kinds of narratives that are being shaped and deployed. So when we're thinking about the cryosphere, and we know that the ice conditions and the climate is changing 3 times faster in the north than anywhere else, except for perhaps in the extreme Antarctic. And a lot of the time these narratives are gloom and doom narratives, and they serve all kinds of purposes, both in terms of policy decision making, short-term gains for corporate interests. And I've been working a lot with Inuit and Indigenous youth who are recasting that gloom and doom narrative to ones of agency, right? So how does that shift actually manifest? And one of the projects that comes specifically to mind, because I saw a question in the chat about, well, what are some examples? Smart Ice, and there's a link that can be shared with everyone. Smart Ice is a live ice tracking device that Inuit youth are building and learning on and coding with satellite imagery to determine the risk levels of the ice here, because many of the Inuit traditional knowledges about the ice, the color of the ice, or the smell of the ice. You know, this is so visceral. This is such a somatic experience, right? But so many of those cues are no longer viable with the changing conditions. And so looking at this question of what is an emergency, well, an emergency is seen as an opportunity to adapt, right? And so how do you take a device like Smart Ice, deploy it across the different place-based, distinction-based communities here in the North with Inuit knowledge as science, right? And looking at the ways in which the cycles of oppression and the cycles of forced displacement, both of humans and of animal migrations, from the caribou to the narwhal to the polar bear, right? How do we take that into this context of, yes, there are actual emergencies. Just 2 weeks ago, our rescue search and rescue teams had to go out and save two very, very different boating groups of people because of the changing conditions, where even the elders no longer have the capacity to understand the winds and how they might influence the local conditions on the sea or with the tides, right? So it's a loaded word, but it's also a word, like this notion of emergency and crisis is also one that galvanizes these narratives and projects of agency and of adaptation, right, in a local way.
One thing I just mentioned briefly, I identify with everything the panelists have discussed. One thing I just wanted to mention is in my work, one of the problems I've seen is that sometimes people seek to emphasize emergency and urgency by falling back on fairly narrow portrayals of Indigenous people and the types of risks that Indigenous people face. And those narratives are narrow, they're oftentimes romantic, and they exclude some of the hard issues that the panelists are discussing, as well as also the solutions that the panelists have been discussing as well, that Indigenous people and people of color are taking.
Deborah, did you want to add anything on this question about emergency? Oh, you're muted.
I agree with what the panel, the opinions that the panel has expressed. But I also believe, as Deborah mentioned, that communities have the voice to change the narrative. what is an emergency and what is a crisis for them. But that takes a very brave and a very courageous adaptation professional or a group of adaptation professionals to allow that to happen. We have a responsibility to make a platform through ASAP for those voices to be heard. I think that's what I am most concerned about with our organization, and that we create a space and defend that space for communities to tell their own stories and to vocalize how emergency and crisis is defined for them.
Thanks, Deborah. I think that ties into the next question that we have, really, in how community members speak of the situation, and also then how we acknowledge what community members are saying in our adaptation work. So our next question is, as climate impacts become more widespread and severe, individuals and communities are experiencing increased trauma and grief. How do you acknowledge and address trauma and grief in your work?
I'd love to get the ball rolling here. So actually, to use the words of Beth Gibbons, we turn on the news and see disaster porn, buildings crashing down, flood waves in subways, and flooding in Detroiters' basements, and forest fires burning homes down. So the first step is, I believe, to acknowledge trauma and grief, to recognize that it's in all of us. It's embedded in our minds and in our bodies, all the way down to our fingertips. Grief can be processed in a variety of different ways. Some as small as having a ceremony for the death of one tree, to as large as processing grief through an entire career, which is how I sometimes view the trajectory of my life. Grieving takes more than taking one sick day from work. It's painful and it's non-linear, and it requires both individual and collective attention. That being said, while many of us on the call are experiencing trauma, I think it's crucial that we center the voices of people who have been harmed by systemic oppression and injustice in our conversations about equity and justice. Thanks.
Thanks, Camilla.
I'm in a lot of discussions with scientifically trained adaptation professionals that are working with communities, and oftentimes I'll hear from them that the communities they're working with need further kind of education about like what exactly climate change is. And some of the examples they give are often kind of horrifying. Like, for example, a common one I hear in different parts of the world is that when folks in adaptation will say interview a group of Native folks about what they think of climate change, the responses will, people talk about things like mining or deforestation. And so some of the adaptation professionals will be like, well, that's not about the rise in temperature or changes in precipitation, but I think the irony of that is that those responses seem to me actually to be cutting pretty directly into what what climate change is, right? Anyways, I'll just leave it there.
I think in some of the initiatives that we've done in the city, the one area that I've tried to explore, for example, if we're trying to understand previous impacts of hazardous events that have impacted certain neighborhoods or even certain homeowners or business owners within the city. Some of those situations were certainly traumatic to that family or that business owner as to the impacts of whatever disaster occurred. When trying to find solutions to prevent or mitigate those impacts from happening in the future, I think my number one thing is to listen. I don't know what they felt. I don't know what they experienced. To me, I think the number one thing I can do at that point is listen, particularly because they may not have had anybody in a position of power, whether it be in the city or their insurance company or whoever it might have been, ever listen to them and their experience through that hazardous event. So I just think that's one thing I can do is to listen to their story.
Yeah, I think that is really, really important, this act of witnessing and act of listening. The work that I've done with individuals and groups around climate trauma, you know, one of the first things that changes people's physiologies, like when we talk about how grief and even numbness, or some people are feeling so ashamed because they feel disconnected, right? And they go, well, how could I feel disconnected to this? It's so impactful. The first thing to do is to take away the sense that this is somehow pathological. In fact, grief, numbness, overwhelm, this is actually the mind, body, spirit, heart adaptation to intolerable conditions, right? So trying to get that sense of this is a mechanism of protection, a mechanism of safety, to experience this and to recognize that this is what is happening. The importance of listening, the importance of creating places for acknowledgement and commonality, for communicating with each other, that I think, and also the importance of creativity and presencing. So there's a lot of work that is being done around the importance of contemplative practice, and whether or not that is being out in a hammock, a sled on the ice, and just being aware of every sensation, or if it's a sitting practice of meditation from one tradition or another. There's just a lot of work being done looking at the ways in which the contemplative practice, creativity, and connection can help support the work, whatever those emotions that come up. And sometimes they are felt as deep grieving, and sometimes, as I said, they're felt as a sense of disconnection that often layers on a whole other set of emotions like guilt or shame for feeling that, right? But they are really, it's really important to depathologize that whole conversation around emotion and adaptation practicing, because it's not often considered within the Western point of view that scientists and, scholars or whatever should be concerned with their own, certainly, but with others' emotions in figuring out what the next best steps are.
Thank you, Deborah. And I see we're getting suggestions also in the chat about getting more in there. The Climate Migration Network has a Lead with Listening guidebook that suggests approaches to listening and a trauma-informed approach to conversations with communities. So more opportunities to learn more about that. Deborah, did you want to add on this one? We've got one more question after this, but I think we have time certainly to hear from you on this question as well.
Only one quick thing. I was homeless after Hurricane Katrina. And one of the things that was most important was that, as I look back on it, is that my home wasn't bulldozed and the spot cleaned off right away. I had an opportunity, and it took a very long time to process what had happened. Of course, we were without, much like Louisiana now, without lights, without power, without food. I-10 corridor runs along the Gulf Coast, so any disruption in the supply chain at one point disrupts the supply chain every place. So there was no food, no fresh water. And I was not in New Orleans or on the Mississippi coast. That's how big the storm was. I was a good 75, 80 miles away. But again, it takes time to memorialize a life, even if it's the life of your house. It takes time to process the loss. And I think that that's something that we haven't seen, or I have not seen in any of the FEMA projects or the adaptation projects or any of the references to processing grief after storms, hurricanes. Well, I can't imagine what it would be like to go back to your house after wildfire and just see smoldering ruins. I can't even imagine it. So I believe that that's something that we all need to consider in our practice going forward.
Thank you, Deborah, for that and for sharing the personal side of it for you as well. The final question that we'll get to today in this panel is about best practices. It's about the intent of ASAP really to lift up these practices and stories so that we can share them within the network with those who are here today and those who can listen to the recording of this in the future and learn how we can all do better. So the question is that there are many practices for advancing justice and equity and adaptation that we can lift up and better integrate into our work as adaptation professionals. What practices are you using in your own work that you are most excited about?
I'm happy to start this one off. With our Resilient Nashua initiative that we conducted a few years ago, we tried to take a different perspective on the traditional hazard mitigation planning that we had done for so many years and really wasn't resulting in the inclusive or successful implementation of any project to reduce risk in the community. It was really just meant to put a plan on the shelf, and it really wasn't great. We looked at pre-disaster recovery planning as an aspect of it, and the reason we included that as part of that process was we had the opportunity before a disaster to actually include the diverse communities across the city, stakeholder groups, citizens who were not at the table. We have the opportunity to do that before a disaster, and it's much more difficult to engage with those same populations in the middle of a crisis. So I would just recommend to folks that are here on this call is, now is the time to reach out to these groups, be intentional about reaching out to these groups and bring them to the table to plan the changes that they'd like to see in their communities, or the lack of changes that they'd like to see within their neighborhoods. I mean, some things they would prefer to stay the same after a crisis where a building was damaged or a road was destroyed. But we want to do that now versus trying to rush around in the middle of a crisis situation. That's not a great way to be inclusive in your planning after an emergency.
Thanks, Justin. Best practices. Anybody else want to share a best practice? Kyle?
I think
Deborah? You're both unmuted.
Oh, well,
go ahead, Kyle. I'll follow you.
Visual cues.
Well, I'm just thinking through what Deborah had already shared with some of the art and expression that Deborah does. I've really thought for a long time that the arts is the missing kind of field within adaptation.
So that's a perfect segue. That's a perfect intro, because I wanted to share something with you. And again, I'm going to be a little, I'm going to ask for a little bit of leeway with the term best practice. I have some issue with that. It kind of best practice belies the specificity of different communities and locations and temporalities, right? And so I would say good practices, or I would say useful practices for consideration, but I'm not a fan of best practices. So I'm not about to suggest the project that I'm talking about as a best practice. It is a practice, and it's aligned with what Kyle was just saying. I'm putting it into the chat here. It's a project that is currently underway. It's called Letters to the Ice, and I have been inviting letters to the ice from around the world for people who are living in Kenya, for example, and who talk about how it would take an entire day of serious hiking to get up to the top of Mount Kenya to get to a little bit of ice, and yet how the ice for him holds such a huge spiritual and symbolic understanding of his connectedness to everyone in cryospheric conditions, right? And so this Letters to the Ice, I invite everyone to get in touch with me. Write your letter to the ice. I will post them with your permission. And when we're back into ice season, and we're not quite there yet, I will bring the letters to the ice and I will read them to the ice. And these letters can be love letters, they could be letters of apology, they could be letters of mourning or faith. And I think that what Kyle was talking about, the importance of aesthetics, the importance of recognizing the somatic and the physicality of our environment is not just important to adaptation, it could be the crucial piece of really connecting with people and their experiences in order to awaken in them a sense of responsibility, right? A sense of responsibility to place, to people, and to the histories of both of oppression, colonization, but also of survivance, as Gerald Visner uses the term most recently, this capacity to survive and thrive, even despite colonization. So yeah, that's what I got. Not best practice by any means, but a practice that I invite everybody to take part in.
Thank you, Deborah. Deborah and Camilla.
A lot of my work is based on storytelling and pictures and GIS, mixed methods. I combine all of those three, and it's a very inexpensive way for a community to reaffirm and to document themselves. And so we have been looking at sacred sites like graveyards and places that will probably be submerged in about 15 to 20 years. And it's a project of remembrance. And I also am involved with ITEP. And so it's a resource that can be used if a community is interested in doing a climate or adaptation plan. Most of the communities I work with are not federal tribes, so they don't have access to that process through FEMA, but you can do your own. You can, if you are close to a community and have their permission and authorization, that is a practice that a community can use for itself. And I try to promote that as much as possible in my work.
Final word. It's nice. It's really nice to be among creatives. Deborah already mentioned this, but I too engage in contemplative practice, which is more than just meditation. It's it's made me a better listener, and it's made me more conscious about my tendencies to react defensively or selfishly. It's just made me a better human. So I guess my final words would be that adaptation work doesn't have to be normative. It can be creative, and it can be personal.
Thank you all so much for all of your contributions to this conversation, which I think these conversations are a part of our practice, the ability to listen to each other and to reflect on the skills that we all have, and the challenges that we face, and the ways that we creatively approach them. So I'm truly grateful for all that you've all contributed, and for being able to be a part of this conversation. So thank you for allowing me to participate in this dialogue as well.